I'm going to be talking to Marla Orenstein, who is the Director of Natural Resources Centre at Canada West Foundation, about a new report, ESG in the Canadian energy sector. Now, ESG stands for Environment, Social, and Governance, and it's a score that investors and financiers use to rate companies on where they stand on things like climate emissions, GHG emissions. Marla joins us from Calgary. Welcome to the interview, Marla.
Thanks so much. It's always a delight to be here.
Well, a delight to have you. Now, can you give us an overview of your report, please?
Absolutely. This is a report that we did in partnership with CECN, the Canadian Energy and Climate Nexus. And we both wanted to look at the issue of the rise of ESG, some of the hype around ESG, and the extent to which it really held true or not, the current reporting practices of ESG in the Canadian energy sector, and a little bit about what both companies and governments can be doing to respond to the increasing ESG wave.
Right. Now, my understanding is that ESG scores, and there are agencies now that actually do the research and score oil and gas companies, amongst others. And is that been, are Canadian companies getting low ESG scores, and is that affecting their access to capital?
Yeah, ESG is something that's used by the financial community, but it's used in a number of different ways. And the part that you're referring to, which are these private ESG rating agencies, I have to say are a headache for almost any company, energy or otherwise, who does ESG. They have popped up trying to bring some sort of a service to many of the financial investors who want to better understand companies and be able to compare them, but it's a little bit of a wild west. It's turned into a little bit of a game. There's over 600 different rating approaches that are out there among them. And so a lot of companies are really pulling their hair out, chasing what they feel is a bit of a game. There's also really, really poor correlation from one rating agency to another. There was a study that came out of MIT within the last 2 years, and it looked at those correlations of rating agencies. And when you have credit rating agencies, financial credit rating agencies, the correlation's really, really high on a scale of, well, they rate it as out of 0 to 1. It comes in as 0.99 if you look between Standard & Poor's and Moody's. This is because there's accountability for it. But when you look at the correlation among these different rating agencies, they looked at 6 of the big ones and looked at the same set of 800 companies. The correlation was down to 0.61. And when you drop to social and governance, it was down around 0.4 or 0.3. So these companies aren't looking at exactly the same thing when they go and try to rate a firm. So that's really frustrating. At the same time, it's not the only type of rating that's out there. A lot of the large financial institutions, like RBC, for example, has its own special sauce. So they don't always rely on these type of rating agencies.
One of the points that was made in your report is that there's a discrepancy in the Canadian oil and gas industry between who does and who doesn't report on ESG. So the top 36 producers, the bigger companies, they have the resources to do this, and 100% of them report. But on the smaller producer side, only 20% report for ESG. Frankly, I'm not surprised. What do you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it has to do with the very size of them. I mean, it means they have larger reputational issues, they have larger financial needs, but they also have larger resourcing to be able to engage in this. So it's not a surprise that the large ones are actually doing it more. In terms of the pressures on the smaller ones, they're different. There's a lot more companies that are privately held rather than publicly held, as well as being smaller and just getting into it. So I certainly expect the numbers to increase like they have in every sector, but there's no single number that you could apply to the oil and gas sector. I really think there's a bifurcation between the big guys right now and the rest of them.
Now, Canada has a unique problem, at least I think it's unique, in that Canada as a role, and you see this, if you look at the investor presentations from the big companies like Suncor and Cenovus and Imperial Oil and so on, they all tout the fact that Canada has really high ESG scores as a nation. And the problem here is the industry doesn't always score real well, because it actually does well on social, it does well on governance, it doesn't do so well on environment. And one of the reasons is because E now is mostly GHG emissions. And that penalizes particularly the oil sands companies, which they have high carbon intensity bitumen and heavy crude. That's the way it is.
Yeah, I think it gets at one of these frustrations again. But to go to your first point about saying, well, Canada has really high ESG scores. Truly, we have a lot of natural environment across the country, and we don't have child slaves and all kinds of fantastic things that contribute to our score. I don't think that means that companies should be resting on their laurels. And there are some actors who are trying to say it's good enough that the country has high things. This must mean that every company within it automatically gets a high score. And that really is not the case. Just as you know that if you go to a really good school, you can still be a failing student. It's not enough to cover it. So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of what each company needs to do. But again, going back to the frustration, a lot of the framework for rating ESG don't really have any understanding of specific sectors and how they operate. And it paints everybody with the same brush. And so there isn't an understanding of why a certain company might need to use more water or might have higher emissions than certain other types of things. Because fundamentally, it's not a sustainability tool, it's a financial risk tool. And there's really a difference between those two.
Now, where's this going, do you think, Marla? I see this all the time. The oil companies are, well, the commentators are not the companies themselves. But people who comment on the industry think this is a fad and that we'll probably see it decline over, the next, say, 2 to 5 years. What's your take?
I don't think we're going to see a decline. I think that the rise seems to be meteoric. And it is happening at a time where culturally there's a lot of re-examination of values as to what we expect companies and individuals and how we hold accountability for people to show up in the world. And this is one way of approaching it. We certainly have seen this before. I mean, you remember triple bottom line, people, profit, planet, and you'll remember CSR. And in many ways, this is an evolution of this. But it seems to have more traction this time. So I don't think that it's going away. At the same time, going back to what I said in the previous answer, it is not the solution for all the ills of companies and planets and profitability and greed and all kinds of other problems. And even if they score perfectly on ESG, companies are still going to need to separately address the concerns of stakeholders in a lot of other areas, because those two things, ESG and what, say, energy host communities care about, are not the same thing.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the Canadian oil and gas industry, part of it anyway, has a real access to capital problem. If you look at the Alberta Securities Commission reports, the small producers in particular are almost just being starved of capital. The big companies have strong balance sheets, so they're okay. And then the medium companies, it's kind of some do and some don't. So is paying attention to ESG something that will improve access to capital, or maybe not?
I think it will. It won't solve the problem of an investor who's looking at different sectors to invest in and where to put their money. But for those who are trying to distinguish among companies within the Canadian energy sector, it really seems to be acting more and more as a guide for what is, alongside financial risk, other types of risk that could impact the investment. This isn't necessarily causational. It doesn't necessarily mean that because you do ESG well, that means your financial performance will improve. It probably both of these things, good financial performance and good ESG scores, stem from good management. So it can be taken as an indication, even if it doesn't change other things.
Well, Marla, thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Lovely to be here.